On the morning of June 20th, 1837, an 18-year-old girl was awakened at Kensington Palace to be told she was now queen of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. Victoria had gone to sleep as a sheltered princess and woken up as the sovereign of 60 million subjects across the globe. But here's what's remarkable about this moment that would define the next century. This young woman, barely out of her teens, would not just inherit an empire, she would transform it into something unprecedented in human history. Most people think they know Queen Victoria. They picture a stern, black-clad widow who somehow managed to give her name to an entire era. But that image only tells half the story. And it's not even the most interesting half. What if I told you that beneath the morning dress and the famous phrase, "We are not amused," lived one of history's most complex rulers, a woman who wielded more influence than any monarch before or since, who presided over the greatest expansion of empire in human history, and whose personal struggles would reshape the very nature of royalty itself? Today, we're diving deep into the extraordinary life of Queen Victoria, and I promise you'll discover a figure far more fascinating than the history books ever taught you. We'll explore how a teenage girl became the empress of a quarter of the world's population, how she navigated the treacherous waters of constitutional monarchy while secretly pulling strings behind the scenes, and how her most devastating personal tragedy would both paralyze and ultimately define her reign. But first, let me give you some context that will blow your mind. When Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, the British Empire covered roughly 4 million square miles. By the time of her death in 1901, it had grown to over 11 million square miles and governed 400 million people. That's not just growth, that's the systematic domination of global politics by a relatively small island nation. We're talking about an empire so vast that the sun literally never set on British territory. How did this happen? And what role did Victoria herself play in this unprecedented expansion? The truth is, Victoria's story begins long before she became queen, in the corridors of Kensington Palace where she lived, what she would later describe as a rather melancholy childhood. Born Alexandrina Victoria on May 24, 1819, she was never supposed to be queen. She was fifth in line to the throne when she was born, but a series of deaths and the fact that her three uncles had no legitimate surviving children meant that this little girl would inherit one of the most powerful positions on earth. Her father, the Duke of Kent, died when Victoria was just 8 months old, leaving her to be raised by her German mother, Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. Now, here's where things get interesting from a psychological perspective. Victoria's childhood was dominated by what was called the Kensington system, a strict protocol designed by her mother and Sir John Conroy that kept the future queen isolated from court life and under constant supervision. She wasn't allowed to be alone. She had to sleep in her mother's room every night, and she was deliberately kept away from her royal relatives. This isolation had profound consequences. When Victoria finally became queen, she was remarkably naive about court politics and the realities of ruling an empire, but she had also developed an iron will and an intense desire for independence. The moment she became queen, one of her first acts was to move her bed out of her mother's room. She had tasted freedom, and she was never going back. But here's what makes Victoria's early reign so remarkable. She had to learn how to be a constitutional monarch in an era when that role was still being defined. The Britain she inherited in 1837 was undergoing massive changes. The Industrial Revolution was transforming society. The middle class was demanding political representation, and the old aristocratic order was being challenged like never before. The monarchy itself was at a crossroads. It could either evolve or risk becoming irrelevant. Victoria's early political education came from two key figures who would shape her understanding of royal power. The first was Lord Melbourne, her first Prime Minister, who became something of a father figure to the young queen. Melbourne taught her the delicate art of constitutional monarchy, how to wield influence without appearing to have political power. The second was her future husband, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, who would prove to be not just her greatest love, but her most trusted political advisor. The marriage between Victoria and Albert in 1840 was initially met with skepticism by the British public. Albert was seen as a foreign interloper, a German prince who would drain the royal coffers and potentially influence British policy in favor of continental European interests. But what actually happened was far more complex and ultimately transformative for the monarchy. Albert brought to the partnership a sophisticated understanding of constitutional government and a vision for what the monarchy could become in the modern world. Together, Victoria and Albert pioneered what we might recognize today as the modern royal brand. They understood that in an age of expanding democracy and growing republican sentiment, the monarchy needed to justify its existence through service, moral leadership, and symbolic representation of national values. This is where Victoria's political acumen really begins to show. While the constitutional reforms of the 19th century were gradually stripping the monarch of direct political power, Victoria found ways to maintain and even expand royal influence through other means. She mastered the art of what one historian called dignified power, the ability to shape events through consultation, encouragement, and warning rather than direct command. Victoria's approach to her royal boxes, the endless stream of government documents that required her attention, reveals just how seriously she took her constitutional duties. Unlike many of her predecessors, who often treated these papers as tedious formalities, Victoria read everything. She asked probing questions, demanded detailed explanations, and wasn't afraid to express her opinions forcefully in private correspondence with her ministers. This meticulous attention to detail gave Victoria something that was perhaps more valuable than direct political power: information. She knew what was happening in every corner of her empire, from the smallest administrative details to the grandest strategic decisions, and she used this knowledge skillfully to influence policy behind the scenes. But Victoria's early reign wasn't just about learning the ropes of constitutional monarchy. It was also about presiding over the most dramatic expansion of empire in human history. The 1,842 and 1,850 saw British control extend across vast new territories in Asia, Africa, and Oceania. The acquisition of Hong Kong following the First Opium War, the expansion of British influence in India, and the systematic colonization of Australia and New Zealand all happened during Victoria's early reign. What's fascinating is how Victoria herself viewed this imperial expansion. She saw herself not just as Queen of the United Kingdom, but as the sovereign of a global empire that brought civilization and progress to less developed regions of the world. This wasn't just political rhetoric. Victoria genuinely believed in what she saw as Britain's civilizing mission, and she took a personal interest in the administration of her far-flung dominions. The benefits of this imperial expansion to Britain were enormous. Raw materials flowed from the colonies to British factories, while manufactured goods found ready markets across the empire. The wealth generated by this system funded everything from grand public works projects to the expansion of the Royal Navy that protected British trade routes around the world. But this expansion came at a tremendous cost, particularly for the indigenous populations of colonized territories. The British Empire's growth during Victoria's reign involved brutal subjugation, forced displacement, and the systematic destruction of local cultures and economies. Victoria herself, despite her later reputation for moral propriety, was a proud imperialist who rarely questioned the methods used to expand and maintain British rule. As we delve deeper into Victoria's story, we'll see how her personal relationships, her devastating losses, and her remarkable resilience would shape not just her own reign, but the very nature of monarchy itself. The young woman who had awakened to find herself queen would face challenges that would test every aspect of her character, and the decisions she made would echo through history long after her death. Now, let me tell you about what happened next, because this is where Victoria's story takes a dramatic turn that would define everything that followed. In 1853, something occurred that would test every aspect of Victoria's political skills and reveal just how much influence she could wield when British lives were on the line. The Crimean War began as a distant conflict over religious rights in the Ottoman Empire, but it quickly escalated into something much more significant: Britain's first major military engagement since the Napoleonic Wars ended nearly 40 years earlier. And here's what's remarkable about Victoria's response. While her ministers debated strategy in Parliament, the Queen was conducting her own parallel diplomacy behind the scenes. Victoria understood something that many of her contemporaries missed. This wasn't just a war. It was a test of whether Britain could still project power on the global stage. The empire she had inherited was built on the assumption of British military superiority, but that assumption hadn't been tested in decades. Everything was on the line. What followed was perhaps the most intense period of Victoria's early political education. She threw herself into the war effort with an energy that surprised even her closest advisors. She studied military dispatches, questioned generals, and pushed her ministers for more aggressive action. But more importantly, she began to understand how public opinion could be shaped and mobilized to support imperial policy. The war also revealed something else about Victoria's character that would become increasingly important as her reign progressed: her ability to adapt the monarchy to changing circumstances. When reports began filtering back about the appalling conditions faced by British soldiers in the Crimea, Victoria didn't retreat behind protocol and precedent. Instead, she personally visited wounded soldiers in military hospitals, becoming the first British monarch to do so during wartime. These hospital visits weren't just symbolic gestures, they were calculated political moves that helped establish Victoria as a monarch who cared personally about her subjects' welfare. The image of the Queen comforting wounded soldiers became a powerful tool for maintaining public support for the war effort, and it established a precedent for royal involvement in national crises that continues to this day. But the Crimean War also taught Victoria harsh lessons about the realities of imperial power. The conflict exposed serious weaknesses in British military organization and logistics. Thousands of soldiers died not from enemy action, but from disease and inadequate medical care. The war that was supposed to demonstrate British strength instead revealed dangerous vulnerabilities in the imperial system. Victoria's response to these revelations tells us everything we need to know about her political instincts. Rather than trying to suppress criticism or deflect blame, she pushed for military reforms and supported the efforts of reformers like Florence Nightingale. She understood that the empire's long-term credibility depended on its ability to learn from mistakes and adapt to new challenges. The successful conclusion of the Crimean War in 1856 marked a turning point in Victoria's reign. She had proven that she could be an effective wartime leader, and she had demonstrated the monarchy's continued relevance in an age of democratic reform. But more importantly, she had learned how to use her position to shape public opinion and influence policy outcomes. This experience would prove invaluable as Victoria faced the next great crisis of her reign, one that would test everything she had learned about imperial governance and constitutional monarchy. In 1857, news reached London of a massive uprising in India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. The Indian Rebellion, as it came to be known, would force Victoria to confront the most fundamental questions about imperial rule and her own role as sovereign of a global empire. The rebellion began with sepoys, Indian soldiers in the British East India Company's army, refusing to use cartridges they believed were greased with cow and pig fat, violating both Hindu and Muslim religious beliefs. But what started as a military mutiny quickly spread into a broader uprising against British rule across northern and central India. Victoria's initial response reveals just how much her political thinking had evolved since the early days of her reign. Rather than simply supporting whatever policy her ministers recommended, she insisted on detailed briefings about the causes of the rebellion and the various options for British response. She understood that decisions made in London would have consequences for millions of people across the subcontinent. What's particularly striking is how Victoria approached the religious and cultural dimensions of the crisis. Unlike many of her contemporaries, who saw the rebellion primarily through the lens of racial superiority, Victoria recognized that British policies had genuinely offended deeply held religious beliefs. She pushed for more culturally sensitive approaches to colonial administration, even as she supported the military campaign to suppress the uprising. The suppression of the Indian Rebellion was brutal, with atrocities committed on both sides, but Victoria's response to these events shows her growing sophistication as an imperial ruler. She condemned excessive violence by British forces while also recognizing the need to maintain imperial authority. It was a delicate balancing act that required all the political skills she had developed over 2 decades of constitutional monarchy. The aftermath of the rebellion led to one of the most significant administrative changes of Victoria's reign: the dissolution of the East India Company and the transfer of direct control over India to the Crown. This wasn't just a bureaucratic reorganization. It was a fundamental shift in how the British Empire would be governed going forward. Victoria took a personal interest in this transition, insisting that the new system of imperial administration respect Indian customs and religious practices while maintaining British political control. She even learned basic Hindi and Urdu, becoming the first British monarch to study the languages of her Indian subjects. This wasn't just symbolic. It reflected her genuine belief that effective imperial rule required understanding and respecting local cultures. In 1876, Parliament officially recognized this new relationship by granting Victoria the title Empress of India. The ceremony was held not in London but in Delhi, with Victoria represented by her viceroy in a grand durbar that deliberately echoed the traditions of Mughal imperial court. It was a masterpiece of political theatre that established Victoria as the legitimate successor to India's historical rulers, while maintaining British administrative control. But Victoria's approach to empire wasn't just about grand ceremonial gestures. She also recognized that the long-term stability of British rule depended on creating opportunities for advancement within the imperial system. She supported the establishment of new universities in India, the expansion of railway networks, and the development of local administrative institutions that gave educated Indians a stake in the colonial system. This pragmatic approach to imperial governance reflected Victoria's growing understanding of how power actually worked in the modern world. She had learned that sustainable authority couldn't be maintained through force alone. It required legitimacy, and legitimacy required at least some degree of consent from the governed. As Victoria entered the middle decades of her reign, she had transformed from an inexperienced teenager into one of the most skilled political operators of her generation. She had mastered the art of constitutional monarchy, successfully navigated major military crises, and overseen the most significant expansion of empire in human history. But her greatest challenges and her most profound personal struggles still lay ahead. The year 1861 would shatter everything Victoria thought she knew about herself, her reign, and her capacity to endure loss. What happened next wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a crisis that would fundamentally alter the British monarchy and test whether the empire Victoria had helped build could survive without her active leadership. Prince Albert had been complaining of stomach pains and fatigue throughout the autumn of 1861. Victoria, ever the devoted wife, initially dismissed his symptoms as overwork. Albert had always been a perfectionist, throwing himself into every project with an intensity that sometimes worried even Victoria. He was redesigning military uniforms, planning the layout of new museums, corresponding with scientists across Europe, and still finding time to review the endless stream of government papers that formed the backbone of royal constitutional duties. But by December, it was clear that something was seriously wrong. Albert was running high fevers, struggling to eat, and spending most of his time confined to bed. The royal physicians diagnosed typhoid fever, though modern medical historians suggest he may have been suffering from stomach cancer or Crohn's disease. What matters for our story isn't the exact medical cause, it's what happened next. On December 14, 1861, at just 42 years old, Prince Albert died at Windsor Castle, with Victoria holding his hand. In that moment, everything changed. The woman who had spent 24 years learning how to balance personal desires with public duty, who had mastered the art of constitutional monarchy, who had overseen the expansion of the greatest empire in human history, was suddenly faced with a loss so devastating that it would define the rest of her life. Victoria's immediate response was complete emotional collapse. She later described experiencing paroxysms of despair and yearning and longing, and of daily, nightly longing to die that consumed her for months after Albert's death. But here's what makes Victoria's grief historically significant. she didn't just mourn privately. She turned mourning into a form of political theatre that would reshape public expectations of royal behaviour for generations to come. Victoria ordered that Albert's rooms at Windsor Castle be maintained exactly as they were on the day he died. His clothes were laid out fresh every morning, hot water was brought for his shaving, and his personal belongings remained untouched. She commissioned hundreds of busts, paintings, and sculptures of Albert, filling royal residences with memorial images that far exceeded normal Victorian mourning practices. She wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life and used black-edged writing paper for all her correspondence. This wasn't just excessive grief, it was a carefully constructed public persona that served specific political purposes. Victoria understood intuitively that her subjects expected their monarch to embody moral values, and her dramatic mourning demonstrated the depth of her commitment to marriage and family. At the same time, her withdrawal from public life created a sense of mystery and reverence around the monarchy that enhanced rather than diminished royal prestige. But Victoria's mourning had unintended consequences that nearly destroyed the institution she was trying to protect. For over a decade after Albert's death, Victoria rarely appeared in public. She avoided London, cancelled ceremonial functions, and refused to participate in the pageantry that had traditionally justified royal expense to taxpayers. Her subjects began calling her the Widow of Windsor, and not in an entirely sympathetic way. By 1870, Republican sentiment was growing stronger in Britain than at any time since the English Civil War. Newspapers questioned whether the monarchy was worth maintaining if the monarch refused to fulfill her public duties. Political clubs dedicated to establishing a republic formed across the country, and even some of Victoria's own ministers began privately discussing what would happen if she abdicated or died without the monarchy being restored to public favour. This was perhaps the greatest crisis of Victoria's entire reign. Everything she had built, the expansion of empire, the evolution of constitutional monarchy, the careful balance between democratic reform and royal prerogative, was at risk because of her refusal to emerge from mourning. The empire that had grown accustomed to Victoria's steady presence was now being governed by an absent sovereign who seemed more interested in memorializing the dead than ruling the living. Victoria's response to this crisis reveals just how politically sophisticated she had become. Rather than gradually returning to public life, she waited for exactly the right moment to make her comeback. That moment came in November 1871, when her eldest son, the Prince of Wales, fell seriously ill with typhoid fever, the same disease that had killed his father exactly 10 years earlier. The parallels were impossible to ignore. On December 14th, 1871, the 10th anniversary of Albert's death, the Prince of Wales made a dramatic recovery. Victoria immediately announced that there would be a public service of thanksgiving at St. Paul's Cathedral, and she would attend in person. It was her first major public appearance in over a decade, and the political impact was extraordinary. The Thanksgiving service wasn't just a religious ceremony, it was a masterpiece of political theatre that reminded the British public why they needed their queen. Victoria arrived at St. Paul's in an open carriage, dressed in mourning attire but clearly visible to the crowds that lined the streets. The symbolism was perfect. The grieving mother who had nearly lost another family member, the devoted widow finally emerging from seclusion, the monarch returning to serve her people in their moment of shared relief and celebration. The public response was overwhelming. Crowds cheered Victoria with an enthusiasm that hadn't been seen since the early years of her reign. Republican clubs quietly dissolved as their membership evaporated overnight. The monarchy was not only saved, it was stronger than ever, precisely because Victoria had demonstrated that royal authority ultimately depended on public affection rather than constitutional power. But Victoria's return to public life didn't mean a return to her previous patterns of behavior. The woman who emerged from mourning in 1872 was fundamentally different from the energetic young queen who had thrown herself into the Crimean War effort. She was more cautious, more selective about her public appearances, and more dependent on a small circle of trusted advisors to manage the day-to-day business of monarchy. This is where one of the most controversial relationships of Victoria's reign begins to take center stage. John Brown was a Scottish servant who had originally been employed as a stable hand at Balmoral Castle, the royal residence in Scotland that Albert had purchased and renovated during the 1852. After Albert's death, Brown had been assigned to attend Victoria during her daily carriage rides, and gradually he became much more than just a servant. Brown treated Victoria not as a queen, but as a woman, speaking to her with a familiarity that shocked court officials and foreign diplomats. He called her woman instead of Your Majesty, corrected her behavior when he thought she was making mistakes, and generally acted with a presumption that would have gotten any other servant immediately dismissed. But Victoria not only tolerated this treatment, she seemed to thrive on it. The relationship between Victoria and John Brown became the subject of endless speculation and gossip. Some suggested they had secretly married. Others whispered that Brown was acting as a spiritual medium, helping Victoria communicate with Albert's ghost. The press began referring to Victoria as Mrs. Brown, and political cartoons depicted Brown as the real power behind the throne. What was really happening between Victoria and Brown is still debated by historians, but what matters for our story is how this relationship affected Victoria's approach to monarchy. Brown gave Victoria something she desperately needed in the aftermath of Albert's death: honest, emotional support from someone who wasn't trying to manipulate her for political advantage. In return, Victoria gave Brown a level of trust and intimacy that demonstrated her growing understanding of how personal relationships could be used to maintain royal authority. The Brown controversy also revealed Victoria's growing skill at managing public opinion. Rather than trying to suppress gossip about their relationship, Victoria simply ignored it, while quietly demonstrating through her actions that she remained fully committed to her royal duties. She understood that as long as she continued to fulfill her constitutional obligations, the public would eventually lose interest in palace gossip. This calculated approach to scandal management would become one of Victoria's most important contributions to the evolution of modern monarchy. She established the principle that royal private life should remain private as long as public duties were properly performed, a doctrine that continues to shape public expectations of royal behavior today. Meanwhile, the empire Victoria had helped create was continuing to expand and evolve in ways that reflected her own political development. The 1872 saw the completion of the Suez Canal, which dramatically reduced travel time between Britain and India, while increasing British influence in the Middle East. New telegraph cables connected London with colonial capitals around the world, allowing for unprecedented coordination of imperial policy across vast distances. Victoria took a personal interest in these technological developments, recognizing that improved communications would allow her to maintain closer supervision of colonial administration. She insisted on receiving regular reports from governors and viceroys across the empire, and she wasn't afraid to intervene when she believed local officials were making mistakes. This hands-on approach to imperial governance reflected Victoria's growing confidence in her own judgment and her understanding of how royal influence could be exercised indirectly. She couldn't command colonial governors to follow specific policies, but she could ask probing questions, express concerns, and make suggestions that carried enormous weight precisely because they came from the sovereign herself. The culmination of this approach came in 1876, when Victoria officially became Empress of India. The ceremony that marked this transition was carefully designed to demonstrate both British power and respect for Indian traditions. Victoria's representative in India, the Viceroy, presided over a grand durbar in Delhi that deliberately echoed the ceremonial practices of the Mughal emperors, while establishing Victoria as their legitimate successor. Victoria herself took the new title seriously, learning basic phrases in Hindi and Urdu, and insisting that Indian customs be respected within the imperial administrative system. She even employed Indian servants at her British residences, most famously Abdul Karim, who rose from table servant to become one of her most trusted personal attendants and unofficial advisors on Indian affairs. This multicultural approach to empire reflected Victoria's sophisticated understanding of how imperial authority actually worked in practice. She recognized that sustainable colonial rule required more than military force. It needed legitimacy, and legitimacy required at least some degree of cultural accommodation and respect for local traditions. As Victoria entered the final decades of her reign, she had transformed not only herself, but the very nature of British monarchy. The grieving widow who had nearly destroyed the institution through excessive mourning had emerged as a master of political theatre who understood better than any of her predecessors how to maintain royal relevance in an age of democratic reform. But her greatest challenges were still ahead, and the empire she had helped build was about to face tests that would determine whether Victorian imperialism could survive into the 20th century. The 1,880 seconds marked what many historians consider the pinnacle of Victorian imperial confidence. But for Victoria herself, this decade would bring new forms of political complexity that tested every skill she had developed over nearly 50 years on the throne. The empire now stretched across 6 continents, but governing it required a delicate balance between central authority and local autonomy that even Victoria's considerable political talents would struggle to maintain. Consider what Victoria was managing by this point in her reign. She was receiving daily reports from governors in Australia, Canada, India, and dozens of smaller territories. Each colony had its own political dynamics, economic challenges, and security concerns. The telegraph had made instant communication possible, but it had also created expectations that the monarch would be personally involved in decisions that previous generations of rulers could have safely delegated to local officials. Victoria rose to meet these challenges with characteristic determination. She established what amounted to her own private intelligence network, cultivating relationships with colonial administrators who would provide her with information that sometimes contradicted official government reports. This wasn't constitutional overreach. It was political survival in an era when public opinion could turn against imperial policy overnight if things went wrong in the colonies. The most dramatic test of Victoria's imperial leadership came with the rise of what historians call the new imperialism of the 1,880 seconds and 1,890 seconds. Unlike the earlier expansion of her reign, which had often been driven by commercial interests or strategic necessity, this new phase of empire building was consciously ideological. British politicians and intellectuals began arguing that imperial expansion was not just profitable but morally necessary, that Britain had a duty to bring civilization and progress to less developed regions of the world. Victoria found herself in the unusual position of being more cautious about imperial expansion than many of her ministers. Her decades of experience had taught her that every new territory brought new responsibilities, new costs, and new potential sources of conflict. When younger politicians proposed ambitious schemes for expansion in Africa or Asia, Victoria would ask pointed questions about how these territories would be governed, who would pay for their administration, and what would happen if local populations resisted British rule. This skepticism put Victoria at odds with some of the most prominent figures of her later reign. Politicians like Joseph Chamberlain and Lord Rosebery were enthusiastic advocates of aggressive imperial expansion, while Victoria preferred what she called responsible imperialism, the consolidation and improvement of existing territories rather than the acquisition of new ones. Victoria's death on January 22, 1901, marked the end of an era that had fundamentally transformed not just Britain, but the entire world. The frightened 18-year-old who had awakened to find herself queen had become the architect of modern constitutional monarchy and the empress of the largest empire in human history. Her personal struggles with love, loss, and grief had shaped her into a ruler who understood that true power came not from commanding subjects, but from earning their devotion. Today, as we grapple with questions of leadership, legacy, and the balance between public duty and personal fulfillment, Victoria's extraordinary journey reminds us that the greatest leaders are often those who transform their deepest vulnerabilities into their greatest strength.